Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 2, Halacha 4, Part 2 of the Shir, Art Scroll. We're on 22a1. So the Mishnah stated that shopkeepers are not allowed to sell Demai, and the Halacha Lamaisa is going to be that wholesalers are. And so now we're going to get into the distinctions between what's going to be a wholesaler and a shopkeeper. So the Gemara wants to know who is the Tana who comes up with this ruling. The Gemara says that the scholars said in the name of Rabbi Lazar, that's going to be the contemporary of Rabbi Yochanan, and says in this Gemara it is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, where Rabbi Meir said the rabbis did not permit anyone except a wholesaler to sell Demai. Now, the point of this dispute is going to be like this. Rabbi Meir is going to be permitting selling Demai without tithing it only to someone who usually sells large quantities at a time. This is going to be a professional wholesaler. Now, a private person who sells Demai, they always have to separate out the tithes before they sell it, even, by the way, if it happens to be a large quantity. Let's say this private person buys a very big stock of something. He goes to the shuk, he wants to go sell it. He's not a wholesaler. He doesn't have the hazakah of being a wholesaler. So he still has to tithe it. Now, the sages are holding that it doesn't make a difference whether the seller is a professional wholesaler or not. And the sages are saying that if at this time he has a very, very large quantity of Demai, he is exempt from tithing it, and if he presently sells a small quantity, he is obligated. So the idea here between the sages and Rabbi Meir is going to be, does this guy have the hazakah of being a wholesaler? Did he fall into the category of being a wholesaler or not? So we see this over in Shvius as well. In Shvius, there's going to be criterion on who's going to be considered a big enough merchant or a retailer. And part of that is that they have to get a hazakah. They have to go out every day. They have to have a certain amount of merchandise. They have to be consistent in showing up to sell at the same location. And that's going to determine it. And if it does, then that could be an issue for this retailer on a Shvius year. So Rabbi Meir is going to be holding that the person needs to get the hazakah of a wholesaler, just like the retailer over there in Shvius. And the rabbis are saying that he does not. What matters is the quantity of what he's selling. If he's selling a very, very large stock all of a sudden, now he falls into the category of being a wholesaler. And if he doesn't have a large stock, then he is just a private retailer. He has to separate out the buys. Now, they're going to question if this is really going to be Rabbi Meir, who actually is the, has this opinion in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yosei challenges the scholars, and says, but the Mishnah contradicts you, for the Mishnah states, who are considered people who sell with large measure. For example, wholesalers and sellers of grain, and conclude that there are others besides wholesalers who may sell Demai. That's a question. So the fact that the Mishnah is talking about a wholesaler and a seller of grain demonstrates that the sellers of grain are not, in fact, wholesalers. And so the Mishnah is trying, and by the way, the Mishnah is very precise, and the Mishnah is adding the second category. You have wholesalers, and you have sellers of grain. And if you have to add this extra term, the sellers of grain, it means this is not a wholesaler. That's what this is trying to say. Vilna Goan says like this. He says, evidently, anyone who sells Demai in large quantities, regardless of whether he is a wholesaler or not, is exempt as long as he has a very large quantity to sell. So, in light of this proof, says Arash Cirilio, we must say that the Mishnah's previous reference to the seller's profession of being a shopkeeper does not in fact imply that the exemption depends on what the person usually does. And so the Mishnah is mentioning shopkeepers just as an example, because shopkeepers are selling in small quantities. Now, if the shopkeeper happened to have a very large quantity of Demai, then he would in fact be exempt from tithing. But because the exemption depends on the quantity that he is presently selling and not what the seller usually sells, that's what's going to be the criteria. So, having looked at Rabbi Lazar's statement that this is going to be the opinion of Rabbi Meir, and this does not refer to our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi is going to explain what is Rabbi Lazar referring to. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yossi says, not with regards to this Mishnah did Rabbi Lazar state this ruling, but rather with regards to the following. And he says that a Brisa teaches that, this by the way is a Tosefta in 3:13, says, when are these things said? In other words, what are we talking about where we are lenient with a baker and we're going to require him to separate trumos and maasros and challah, but not maaser sheni? When is this case going to be coming up? And this, by the way, came up in part 1 of this year when we were talking about the bakers. And that's basically going to be where the baker is exempt from separating out maaser sheni from the bread that he bakes with Demai grain. And this Tosefta is stating the exemption only. So the Gemara continues, says, when he sells in his store, in other words, in his bakery, or by the door of his store, in other words, he's putting out loaves of bread in front of his door, in front of the store. And the Gemara continues, but if the baker sells through a palter, or his store that is next to a palter, he must separate all the tithes, even maaser sheni. A palter, by the way, is going to be somebody, and you see this in Jerusalem, they purchase large quantities of loaves, and then they try to sell them individually to retail customers. You will still see this, by the way, in Jerusalem. You still see this in the Arab area in the Old City. And so they'll buy from the baker, and then they'll set up a cart in the Old City, and then they'll try to sell individual loaves. So these kinds of retail sales are done sort of under the radar so that the government at this time is not going to be aware of it, and they're not going to regulate them. That's what the Rashi says over when he's talking about the palter. And so over here, the idea is that the palter being, since he's discreet, he has to separate out the maaser sheni from these loaves, since these sales are not regulated. Now, why did we have the baker ending up where they don't have to separate out the maaser sheni? It seems very curious. And ultimately what comes about actually comes over from the Bavli. It's going to be because the government put on very heavy burdens on tax onto the bakers. And so they basically were saying, look, the burden is so big and the maaser sheni is the biggest of the tithes, that we're going to spare the baker from separating out these tithes because they almost have no profit anyway. And we're going to leave the maaser sheni to be the customer. Now, this is going to be a case where the palter is going to be buying it. He's not in a case where he has government regulation on him. So they're going to say that he has to separate out the tithes, not the customer. So the Gemara continues. It says he must separate out all the tithes, even the maaser sheni. And concerning this brisa, the scholars said in the name of Rabbi Lazar, it is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir is the one who holds that we follow the actual condition of which bread is sold and not what the person is usually selling. So if you have a merchant and he sells small quantities, and all of a sudden now he has a very, very big quantity of grain to sell or bread to sell, we're going to look at what he's actually selling. We're not going to look at what he's usually selling. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So the Gemara is going to ask a question. It's going to say, to which ruling of Rabbi Meir did the scholars refer? In other words, where do we find Rabbi Meir holding that we follow the actual sale and not the usual sale? The Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say in the Mishnah following this one. So this, by the way, is going to be coming up in chapter 2, Halacha 5. In the Mishnah over there, Halacha 5, is going to talk about a rule that's going to be saying that Demai sold in large quantities is tithed by the buyer, while Demai sold in small quantities is tithed by the seller. So over there, Rabbi Meir says regarding that which is usually measured with a large measure, but was in this case measured with a small measure, that the large measure is going to be subordinate to the small measure. So in other words, if they're dealing with certain kinds of produce like grain, and they're usually sold in very large volumes, what's going to be happening if they sell it in a small volume? And basically, we're going to look at how are they actually tithing it. And the Mishnah is going to basically be quoting Rabbi Meir as ruling that the large measure is going to be subordinate to the small one. In other words, we're going to follow the actual manner of the sale, and that the seller must tithe the merchandise. So you're going to be looking at the volume. Is he selling a large volume? Then, according to Rabbi Meir, you're going to be looking at who's going to be tithing it. Is it going to be the buyer or the seller? And if it's going to be a very large volume, he's going to have the status of being a wholesaler, and the wholesaler does not need to separate out the tithes. But if the retailer is doing a small volume on a particular transaction, then he does separate out the tithes. So the Gemara continues, and Rabbi Hia taught in a Baraisa likewise, in the name of Rabbi Meir, regarding that which is usually measured with a large measure, but was in this case measured with a small measure. And so basically what we're talking about is normally the person does business of a very large size, and now he's doing a small size. Or inversely, he's doing a lot of very small transactions, and all of a sudden he has a very, very large grain transaction. So the Gemara here says, according to Rabbi Hia, the large measure is subordinate to the small measure. So what we see here is, according to Rabbi Meir, it is not the quantity by which the item is usually sold, but again, by the actual quantity that is being sold right now in this transaction that's going to determine who is responsible for tithing. And the Gemara says, and so too asserted the scholars in the name of Rabbi Lazar, that Rabbi Meir would apply his principle in the following actual manner in the sale that we're talking about over here, that came up in part 1 of this shiur when we're talking about a baker. So the Gemara now is going to be talking about the palter. The palter is not really a baker, he's just a middleman. And again, you see this in the old city. You have a palter will go to a established baker, and he will buy some inventory. He'll go out with a cart into the old city, and he'll sell the breads one at a time. The Gemara continues and says, a palter usually sells with a small measure, in other words, discreetly, so the government is not going to regulate him. Whereas a baker in his store usually sells in a large measure, and that's going to be very public, and his prices are going to be regulated. So if a baker should happen to sell some loaves in the manner of a palter, so in other words, the baker hires a couple of workers to get some carts, go into the old city, and sell some individual units, Rabbi Meir would rule, says this Gemara, that the large measure is subordinate to the small one. In other words, that the usual public manner of this seller's sale is now going to be subordinate, and the actual discrete manner is going to be how the baker is behaving like the palter, and the baker now in this individual transaction in the old city with this cart is going to be obligated to separate out Meiser Sheni. So then the Mishnah was teaching that shopkeepers who sell in small quantities are going to be required to tithe their Demai merchandise. But we see here that sellers who are selling in large quantities are going to be exempt. And the Gemara is going to give the reason why is it like this. So we've covered that if somebody has a large transaction, they're going to be exempt on it. If they're ending up with small transactions, it's going to be where they're going to have to tithe the Demai. It's based on the time that you're making the transaction. How big is this transaction? So why is this falling into like this in the first place? Why is it like this? So the Gemara says that the scholars said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the reason one who sells with a small measure is obligated to separate out the tithes is on account of the children, that they should not come to eat tevel. So children are not going to be careful on tithes, and they're going to be the customers at a retail shopkeeper. And if they're not going to require the shopkeeper to tithe the produce before they sell it, children are going to end up eating Demai. And this is only going to be to shopkeepers. It's not going to apply to a wholesaler who's going to sell a very large quantity at a time. And since children can't purchase from a wholesaler, we don't need to worry about it. There's going to be a different explanation for this distinction. Rabbi La says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, in the case of a seller who measures with a small measure, since the seller profits, the seller separates the tithes. And in the case of a seller who measures with large measure, since the buyer profits, the buyer separates the tithes. Now, this is trying to say that, and this, by the way, comes out in the Rambam commentary about this, that sellers who deal in large quantities tend not to measure out the precise amounts, but they just heap it out. And since the buyers end up breaking these very large amounts apart and doing some sort of transaction with it, like turning it into bread or doing individual smaller quantities as a retailer, they're going to be more precise about it, and they're going to make a bigger profit on the individual sales, and that's going to cause them to separate out the tithes. So again, it's trying to be concerned by the money. The retailers are going to have a larger profit, and the price per unit for the wholesalers is not going to be as much, and they're really not going to get a very big profit. So the sages, says the Rambam, are freeing them from the burden of tithing. The Gemara is going to note that the Brisa supports this, and the Brisa supports that. So one Brisa supports the sellers or the scholars, another supports Rabbi La, and the Gemara is meaning that one of the Tanaim of the Brisa supports the scholars, and the other Tanaim supports Rabbi La. And the Gemara continues and elaborates and says the Brisa supports the scholars that says, for the Brisa, Rabbi Nehemiah says, whatever is subordinate to a small measure is like the small measure, and whatever is subordinate to a large measure is like the large measure. In other words, Rabbi Nehemiah is talking about two identical cases. In the first, the merchant measures out most of the customer's order in a small, precise measure, and the small amount of produce remains unmeasured. In other words, he doesn't bother to measure out a remainder amount. And the other case is going to be where he measures out a very large heaping measure. And in the second case, the seller is going to measure out the majority of the customer's order with a very large heaping measure, and a small amount will remain unmeasured. In other words, that amount that he measured, there'll be a small amount that's not as precisely measured, he says. There'll be a part left over. And Rabbi Nehemiah is basically saying we follow the majority of the sale. So if the majority of it's going to be measured out, then, and it's going to be in this very large, heaping way, then that's how we're going to follow whether it's going to be sold as a large measure, or if he's selling like individual precise units, then, and that's the majority, then that's how we're going to look at it. In other words, how is this guy measuring to make this sale? Is he selling and he's taking the amount and he's measuring it out in very, very precise amounts? And if he is, that's going to be like a retail sale. And if he's taking out these very big, large quantities and they're big heaping amounts, that's going to look more like a wholesale amount. And again, we're looking at, the small measure versus the large measure. The Gemara continues, and the Brisa supports Rabbi La, and was talking to Brisa. Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, says, whatever amount the merchant measures out for the purchaser with a small measure, the merchant is obligated to tithe. And we're going to finish this up, and it's going to say, even if he measured out for him only a seah and a rova, in other words, even if the greater part of the sale is measured out with a large measure and only a small remnant gets measured out, the merchant must tithe that rova. So rova, by the way, is going to be 1/24th of a seah. And what this is trying to say is that the ruling of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, accords with Rabbi La's explanation, saying that since the seller is earning a large profit on the amount measured out with the rova, that's going to be, 1/24th of the seah, and that's going to be, small retail quantities, very small amounts. He's saying that he has to tithe it. But what the scholars are saying is that the seller does not need to tithe even that small amount that's measured out with the rova, since children are not going to be buying from him with this. Because why? Because it's a seah, which is a very large amount, mixed in with the rova, which is 1/24th of the amount. And so they're saying that if they're buying a seah and one of these small leftover amounts, that anyway, children are not going to be able to afford the seah. So forget about the rova. The rova comes with the seah. It's one seah and one rova in a sale. And so if it were just the rova, then the retailer would have to tithe it because you'd be worried about children. But if it's just going to be the seah, then that's going to be a heaping amount. That's going to be the buyer. The buyer is going to be the one to do that. So we're looking at the seller measuring out the merchandise either with a large measure or a small measure, and that's going to determine whether you have a large transaction or not. Is this going to be precisely calculated, or is this a large heaping amount? The scholars point out another difference between the explanations of the scholars and Rabbi La, and Rabbi Zera says reckoning of a profit is another difference between them. And Rabbi Zera is going to add to this conversation and say, if the seller measures out for him a seah in the manner usually used when measuring out by rovas, since the seller profits, Rabbi La would rule that the seller separates out the tithes. And if he sold him rovas in the manner that he's doing when he's selling out and measuring out this seah, since the buyer profits, Rabbi La would rule that the buyer separates out the tithes. In other words, how are they measuring this out? According to Rabbi La, the reason someone who sells with a very large measure is permitted to sell without tithing is that he only earns a very small profit. He's generously heaping out the measure. It's not as exactly measured. And in this case, if he's not heaping out this measure, he has to separate out the tithes because he's going to, in fact, get a large profit on the sale. Rabbi Kanievsky, in his Derech Emunah 11.2, was pointing out that according to the scholars, since children do not purchase large amounts of product, the buyer is going to be required to tithe the produce. And Rabbi Kanievsky continues to explain this and says, although he measures by rovas, again, a rova is 1/24th of a seah, very precise amount, people are usually going to be careful to measure with level precision. It's not going to be this heaping amount. And the type that's going to be measured out in heaps is going to be the seah. And again, you have 24 rovas in one seah. It's a very large amount. And the seah, in fact, gets into a lot of agricultural laws for Maseket Peah. Now, Rabbi Kanievsky says, to finish this up, according to the scholars, the seller would have to separate out tithes if he's selling in a small measure. And why? Because children would buy from him. So I think what this Gemara is trying to do at the very end is say, look how the seller is selling. If he's selling in a heaping amount, the profit is going to be smaller, it's not as precise, and the obligation is going to be on the buyer. It's also because children are not going to be buying these gigantic quantities. A seah is a gigantic quantity of grain or product. And a rova is going to be precisely calibrated, it's going to be leveled out, and this is going to be 1/24th of a seah, and this is going to be something a child could buy, and so that's going to be something that the merchant has to tithe. So again, one of the things to look at is you also have to look at this individual transaction. So, yes, it's fine that you might be a retailer, but if you're doing a very large heaping amount, that is going to determine that the buyer is going to be doing the tithes, not you. And if you're normally a wholesaler and you're doing, a small rova, which is 1/24th of a seah, then you are going to be responsible for the tithes because it is precise. It's how you're measuring it. It's how precise it is, and also dealing with the profit margin. Have a great day.